On July 20th, 1969, humanity achieved the impossible. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped onto the lunar surface while 650 million people watched on television. It was supposed to be our greatest triumph. But what if I told you that more than 50 years later, millions of people still don't believe it happened? 22% of Americans either doubt the moon landing or think it was completely faked. They believe that instead of launching astronauts into space, the US government gathered a secret crew of filmmakers on a soundstage in Area 51. That legendary director, Stanley Kubrick, was hired to pull off the greatest deception in human history. That 400,000 people working on the Apollo program were all sworn to secrecy. But here's the real question. Why? Why would anyone fake the moon landing? And more importantly, what evidence do conspiracy theorists actually have? Today, we're diving deep into the Apollo 11 moon landing mystery. We'll explore the Cold War politics that made this mission so critical. We'll examine the so-called proof that it was faked. And we'll uncover the real truth behind one of history's most enduring conspiracy theories. This is the story of how we got to the moon, and why some people refuse to believe we ever left Earth. Buckle up. This is going to be wild. The Cold War. To understand why anyone would fake a moon landing, we first need to understand the world in 1969, and that means we need to talk about World War II and the Cold War. In 1941, the United States joined the Allied forces in World War II. The Big Three, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the USA fought together against the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Allies won, but that victory didn't bring peace. Instead, it brought something much more dangerous: the Cold War. America and the Soviet Union, former allies, became bitter enemies. The communists saw the United States as aggressive and trigger-happy, meddling in affairs around the globe. The capitalist Americans feared that the USSR wanted to spread communism across the entire world. But here's what made this war different. Both superpowers had thousands of nuclear weapons, the most deadly weapons humanity had ever created. They wouldn't dare use them against each other. It was a horrifying stalemate. So instead of fighting with bombs, they fought with achievements. And the battleground? Space. The space race had begun. And at first, it was very clear. The Soviets were winning. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. America was shocked. They were falling behind. A few months later, America launched its own satellite. But the humiliation wasn't over. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, orbiting the entire Earth. America had been beaten again. President Eisenhower created NASA, a brand new government agency dedicated entirely to space. America started sending up satellites. They even sent people into space, but they still couldn't match what the Soviets had done. That's when President John F. Kennedy stepped up. Just 1 week after Gagarin's historic flight, Kennedy wrote a desperate letter to his vice president on April 20th, 1961. He asked, "How can we defeat the Soviets? Are we working 24 hours a day? Are we making maximum effort? Is there any space program that would give us dramatic results and allow us to win this race?" The answer came quickly. Send humans to the moon. On May 25th, 1961, Kennedy stood before the nation and made an incredible promise. Before this decade is out, we will land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. It was 1961. No smartphones, no internet, no GPS. Computers were extremely primitive, and Kennedy was promising to send humans 240,000 miles away to another world. Many people thought it was impossible, but the stakes were too high to fail. This wasn't just about exploration. This was about winning the ideological war for the world. Would it be communism or capitalism? The space race had become a matter of national survival, and America was running out of time. The Apollo program and the mission NASA got to work immediately. Between 1961 and 1969, they had less than a decade to achieve what seemed impossible. For this mission, an additional $7 to $9 billion were poured into the space program. The entire space agency mobilized with a single goal: put a man on the moon before the Soviets did. Within months, testing had already begun. First, they tested the rockets that would escape Earth's gravity. Then they tested the heat shields of the command modules to see how much heat they could withstand. The propulsion systems of the service modules were put through rigorous trials. Between 1963 and 1967, numerous tests were conducted all unmanned, meaning no humans were aboard during these dangerous trials. In February 1967, NASA planned its first manned test. This mission was called Apollo 1. But during a ground test on January 27, 1967, disaster struck. A fire broke out inside the cabin, and all 3 astronauts preparing for the mission were killed. It was a devastating setback. Many wondered if the dream of reaching the moon would die with those brave astronauts. But NASA didn't give up. They continued testing. Apollo 4, Apollo 5, and Apollo 6 were all unmanned missions. In October 1968, Apollo 7 successfully sent astronauts into space again. Just 2 months later, Apollo 8 was launched, sending 3 astronauts to orbit the moon. In March 1969, Apollo 9 tested the lunar module, the actual spacecraft that would land on the moon. 2 months after that, Apollo 10 launched, where astronauts practiced almost everything that would be done in Apollo 11. Except the actual landing. You can see the incredible pace NASA was operating at. Every 2 to 3 months, a new mission was launched, testing the next critical step. After all these tests, all the failures, all the near misses, the moment finally arrived. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 was launched from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The mission included 3 astronauts, 38-year-old Commander Neil Armstrong, who was leading the mission, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin. These 3 names would be written into the pages of history. Armstrong and Aldrin would become household names known by everyone even today. But Michael Collins? Not so much. And there's a very interesting reason for that, which we'll get to in a moment. The Apollo 11 spacecraft had 3 main parts: the command module, the service module, and the lunar module. The first 2 together were called the CSM command and service module. The plan was simple, but incredibly dangerous. Only the lunar module would detach and land on the moon. After that, it would have to take off again and reattach with the CSM, allowing the astronauts to return to Earth. If that reattachment failed, the astronauts would die in space. To launch this entire spacecraft, a massive Saturn V rocket was used. Before launch, nearly 1 million gallons of kerosene, liquid oxygen, and liquid hydrogen were loaded into the rocket. The total weight was around 3 million kilograms, equivalent to about 400 elephants. With its incredible power, the spacecraft reached Earth's orbit in less than 10 minutes. After completing about 1.5 revolutions around Earth, Mission Control gave permission for translunar injection, meaning the spacecraft would leave Earth's orbit and head toward the moon. It took several days to actually reach the moon. The astronauts waited inside the cramped spacecraft, sometimes eating freeze-dried food, sometimes sleeping in their seats, and sometimes taking photographs of Earth shrinking behind them. On July 19, 1969, after traveling almost 240,000 miles, the Apollo 11 spacecraft reached lunar orbit. Here, it was time for the critical split. The command and service module separated from the lunar module. Inside the command module was Michael Collins, and this part was nicknamed Columbia. On the other side, the lunar module was named Eagle, and inside it were Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. The role of Columbia was to remain in lunar orbit, circling the moon over and over. Only the Eagle would descend and land on the moon's surface. This meant that only Armstrong and Aldrin would get the opportunity to step onto the moon. Michael Collins would not. This is probably why Michael Collins isn't as widely known. Even though he was part of the Apollo 11 mission, he never set foot on the moon. He spent 21 hours completely alone, orbiting the moon, waiting for his crewmates to return. In fact, whenever he passed over the far side of the moon, he lost all radio contact with Earth and with Armstrong and Aldrin. He was the most isolated human being in existence, utterly alone in a way no one had ever been before. But if we look closely, Collins's role may have been the most important, because later the lunar module had to reattach with the CSM, and if Michael Collins hadn't been there to guide that docking maneuver, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would never have returned alive. At around 8 p.m., the Eagle began its descent toward the moon. At exactly 8:10 p.m., an alarm started ringing, the 1202 alarm. Neither Armstrong nor Aldrin knew what this alarm meant. They immediately contacted Mission Control. "Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm." There was tension in their voices. Mission Control quickly analyzed the problem and told them to ignore it and continue. Later, it was discovered that the alarm meant the Apollo guidance computer's processing system was overloaded, but thankfully the computer was designed brilliantly. Essential programs continued running even during the overload. The computer had an automatic landing program that would land the Eagle on the moon's surface. But at a height of around 500 feet, Neil Armstrong noticed a serious problem. He looked out the window and saw that the lunar module was about to land in an area filled with large, dangerous rocks. If they landed there, the Eagle could tip over or be damaged, stranding them on the moon forever. Armstrong took manual control. He flew the Eagle past the rocky area, searching for a safer landing site about 4 miles away from the original target. Meanwhile, Buzz Aldrin was watching the fuel gauge with growing concern. At 8:16 p.m., he checked the indicator. Only 5% fuel remained. Seeing such critically low fuel, Mission Control initiated a countdown. This countdown would determine whether the landing would proceed or whether the mission would be aborted and the astronauts would return to orbit. The tension was unbearable. Everyone at Mission Control held their breath. Finally, literally in the last minute, with only 30 seconds of fuel remaining, Neil Armstrong's voice crackled over the radio. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." They had done it. They were on the moon. Armstrong then prepared his spacesuit, opened the hatch, and began climbing down the ladder. Around 650 million people around the world were watching this moment live on television, about 20% of the entire human population. When his boot touched the lunar surface, Armstrong spoke the words that would echo through history. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Buzz Aldrin followed shortly after, and together they spent the next 2.5 hours on the lunar surface. They collected 23 kilograms of lunar rocks and soil samples. They took photographs. They set up scientific instruments, a television camera that could transmit signals back to Earth, a device to measure solar wind, and a laser reflector that would allow scientists to measure the exact distance between Earth and the moon. They also installed a seismometer to detect moonquakes. They planted an American flag and left behind a plaque that read, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." But here's where things get interesting and dangerous. The lunar module was supposed to remain on the moon for about 21 hours before taking off again and reattaching with Michael Collins in the command module. But when Armstrong and Aldrin climbed back into the Eagle, they made a terrifying discovery. Remember at the beginning when we mentioned that Armstrong accidentally broke something while exiting the module? That broken piece was the ascent engine arming switch, the switch needed to start the engine and take off from the moon. Without that switch, they were stranded. They informed Mission Control and desperately searched for a solution. Then Buzz Aldrin had a brilliant idea. A switch is essentially just used to complete an electrical circuit. If the circuit was broken, he just needed something conductive to reconnect it. Looking around the tiny cabin, he noticed his felt-tip pen. Using the pen, he pushed it into the broken switch mechanism and completed the circuit. The engine roared to life. It was one of the most improvised, desperate fixes in the history of space exploration. And it worked. The Eagle took off from the moon and successfully reattached with Columbia. All 3 astronauts were reunited and they turned the spacecraft toward home. But the danger wasn't over. For re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, the command module and service module had to separate. The service module would burn up in the atmosphere, but there was a risk. If it broke apart too violently, debris could strike the command module and kill everyone inside. NASA's plan was to use thrusters to push the service module away before separation. But on the return journey, they discovered that the thrusters weren't working properly. All 3 astronauts sat inside the command module and watched through the windows as the service module broke apart nearby. Debris flew in all directions. It was nothing short of a miracle that none of the debris hit them. The risk of death was so high that President Nixon had already prepared an alternate speech, a speech to deliver if the astronauts died. Imagine that, a speech already written, just in case. It said, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men know that there is no hope for recovery, but they also know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice." Thankfully, that speech was never delivered. On July 24th, 1969, the command module safely entered Earth's atmosphere, deployed its parachutes, and splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. All 3 astronauts were alive. They had survived impossible odds, technical failures, and near disasters at almost every step. The Apollo 11 mission was a success. After returning, all 3 astronauts were quarantined for 2 weeks, kept away from other humans due to fears that they might have brought back unknown pathogens from the moon. Fortunately, nothing like that happened. Apollo 11's moon landing became front-page news around the world. What President Kennedy had promised landing humans on the moon before the decade ended, NASA had achieved with just months to spare. America had won the space race, or had they? The conspiracy theories begin. But here's where things get strange. Almost immediately after this historic achievement, even though it was broadcast on live television for the whole world to see, there were rumblings of doubt. Not everyone was celebrating. Isn't it a strange coincidence that Kennedy promised we'd land on the moon before this decade is out in 1961 and NASA delivered in 1969 with only months to spare? Was the timing just too perfect? Could America have faked it to win the Cold War? About a year after the landing, newspaper articles started questioning whether it really happened. 2 years later, the James Bond film Diamonds Are Forever showed Bond stumbling onto a fake moon landing set in the Nevada desert. It was tongue-in-cheek, but it reflected a growing conspiracy theory. Then in 1974, a former U.S. Navy officer and Apollo technical writer named Bill Kaysing published a book called We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle. This book became the foundation of the conspiracy theory. Kaysing argued that the moon landing was so politically important that the US, having failed to develop a feasible plan in time, staged the entire event as Cold War propaganda. His reasoning wasn't entirely unreasonable. It was the Cold War governments did lie and run secret operations. But speculation isn't evidence. However, Kaysing presented photographs and explanations that would become the basis for widespread doubt. The most common theory, that the US, afraid of failing on Kennedy's promise, hired famous director Stanley Kubrick, who had just made 2001: A Space Odyssey, to film a fake moon landing on a soundstage, possibly at Area 51. According to this theory, all the footage we see isn't from the moon at all. It's from a secret film set. By 1977, NASA had to issue an official fact sheet. The first sentence? Yes, astronauts did land on the moon. Can you imagine having to release a statement like that? But the theory didn't die. It became more fringe for a while. But then in 2001, Fox News aired a documentary called Conspiracy Theory: Did We Land on the Moon? It repackaged all the old theories for a new internet-era audience. Shortly after, a conspiracy theorist cornered Buzz Aldrin, demanding he swear on the Bible that he went to the moon. Aldrin, who was 72 years old, punched him in the face. Then a French mockumentary came out with fake interviews suggesting Kubrick admitted to faking the landing. Many people thought it was real, and clips still circulate online today as proof. Today, the conspiracy thrives. One 2019 poll found that 11% of American millennials believe the landing was staged. The theory has all the ingredients of a durable conspiracy: a shadowy government with motives, evidence that seems suspicious to untrained eyes, and that feeling of being in on a secret. But what's the actual evidence conspiracy theorists point to? Let's examine their main claims. Examining the evidence, why people think it was fake. Okay, let's dive into the actual evidence that conspiracy theorists use. I'm not going to dismiss these claims outright. If you're genuinely asking these questions, you deserve real answers. Let's look at each piece of evidence and understand what's really going on. Claim 1. Where are the stars? Look at the moon landing photos. The sky is completely black with no stars visible. But space is full of stars. So why can't we see any? Here's the reality. Photographing stars requires opening your camera shutter for a very long time to let in lots of light. But on the moon, the astronauts are standing on a bright surface, wearing bright white suits with the sun blazing down. To photograph them properly, you need a fast shutter speed with very little light exposure. In these conditions, there's no chance of capturing dim stars in the background. The contrast is too extreme. This is the same reason why when you take a photo at night with your phone's flash on, you can see people clearly, but the stars disappear. It's basic photography, not evidence of a conspiracy. Claim 2. The shadows are all wrong. Conspiracy theorists point to photos where shadows go in different directions. They argue this proves there were multiple light sources, like studio lights on a film set. Here's the reality. Yes, the sun was the only direct light source, but light bounces off surfaces, especially bright white ones. On the moon, light bounces off the lunar surface, the white spacesuits, the lunar module, and reflective equipment creating scattered light from multiple directions. Additionally, the moon's surface has hills, craters, and uneven terrain. When shadows fall on uneven ground, they bend and go in different directions. Camera lenses also distort angles depending on how wide or tight they are. Those impossible shadows are perfectly consistent with one sun and a reflective, uneven surface. Claim 3. The flag is waving. This is probably the most famous piece of evidence. The American flag appears to be waving, but there's no air on the moon, so there's no wind. It must have been filmed on Earth, right? Here's the reality. This isn't a normal flag. NASA designed a special flag with a horizontal rod along the top to keep it extended and visible. Otherwise, it would just hang limp. When the astronauts planted the flag, they had to push and twist it into the ground. This motion caused the fabric to move, and the aluminum rod acted like a spring, making the flag ripple. Here's the key. After the astronauts let go and step away, the flag becomes completely still. It doesn't keep waving like it would in wind. If there was air, the flag would continue moving, but it doesn't. The apparent waving is actually proof there's no atmosphere. Claim 4. The astronauts' movements look fake. Watch the footage. The astronauts move in a strange, unnatural way. It almost looks like they're being pulled up by wires, like in a movie. Here's the reality. The movements look weird because they are weird, but for a legitimate reason. The moon's gravity is 1/6 of Earth's gravity. Our entire lives, our brains, muscles, and balance have been calibrated to Earth's gravity. Now imagine wearing a 180-pound spacesuit and trying to walk where gravity is 6 times weaker than your muscles expect. You're going to move in bizarre ways, jumping higher, falling slower, with a strange bouncing quality. The astronauts are essentially learning to walk all over again in an alien environment. The movements don't look natural because they're not natural to us, but they're exactly what you'd expect from humans in lunar gravity. If anything, these movements would be incredibly difficult to fake convincingly with wires and slow motion. Other claims and conclusion. Now, these aren't the only claims conspiracy theorists make. They point to what looks like a wire in one frame, question why the lunar module's engine didn't produce visible flames, and ask about a rock with the letter C on it, claiming it's a prop marker. They wonder why we haven't been back to the moon in over 50 years, saying if we really went, we'd go again. But here's the thing. Every single one of these claims has been thoroughly debunked. The wire is an antenna. Rocket engines in a vacuum don't produce visible flames like they do in atmosphere. The sea is likely a photographic artifact, and we haven't returned because of money. The Apollo program cost over $100 billion in today's money. After 1972, public interest faded and politicians cut NASA's budget. But let me tell you why I know we really landed on the moon. First, we brought back 842 pounds of moon rocks that have been studied by scientists worldwide, including from rival countries. They all confirmed these rocks are genuinely from the moon. Even the Soviet Union, America's greatest enemy, acknowledged the landing in their official publications. Second, we left laser reflectors on the moon that scientists still use today to measure the exact distance to Earth. And third, modern satellites from multiple countries, Japan, India, China, not just America, have photographed the Apollo landing sites. You can see the lunar modules, the astronaut tracks, and the equipment still sitting there. Think about what it would take to fake this. Hundreds of thousands of people keeping a perfect secret for over 50 years, the Soviet Union staying silent, every independent scientist lying about moon rocks, and multiple countries faking satellite photos. The conspiracy would be so massive that it would actually be harder to fake the moon landing than to just go there. And that's exactly what happened. NASA went to the moon 6 times. 12 astronauts walked on the lunar surface. The Apollo 11 moon landing wasn't humanity's greatest deception. It was humanity's greatest achievement. So what's next for lunar exploration? In December 2017, former President Donald Trump announced plans to increase funding to send humans back to the moon by 2024. This led to the Artemis program, NASA's ambitious plan to return humans to the lunar surface. Named after the twin sister of Apollo in Greek mythology, Artemis aims to land the first woman and the first person of color on the moon. The program plans to establish a sustainable presence on the moon, building a lunar base that will serve as a stepping stone for future missions to Mars. Unlike Apollo, which was about winning a race, Artemis is about long-term exploration and scientific discovery. After more than 50 years, humanity is preparing to return to the moon, and this time we're planning to stay. Well, now I want to hear from you. Was the Apollo 11 moon landing faked? Was it only a hoax? Or did astronauts really land on the moon? Comment your opinion below. If you found this video informative, hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more interesting documentaries. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.